Yes.
Brilliant. Well, thank you everybody for being here. I'm happy to be interrupted at any time because I'm never good at giving talks at the best of times, and this one is even less well prepared than usual. To the extent that I had a look at my abstract and my title last night, and my mind just went to mush. I couldn't work out what to talk about. And I found my mind drifting instantly to what was happening, what had happened during the day. So the first thing, this chap here on the top left is this computer scientist who resigned prominently from Google yesterday, claiming that he was so terrified of what artificial intelligence was going to do for our species, for the planet in general, and he could no longer countenance working in it. I think he might be wrong. I asked ChatGPT what it thought of me yesterday, and it was ever so positive. It thinks great things, and it tells a beautifully written story all about my work, and it makes things up completely. I mean, I think I would know if I'd won a Royal Society Wolfson Research Merit Award, because apparently it gives me lots of money. So these things are not as good as they seem. The other thing that I noticed yesterday, I met my friend June, who's the lady on the right of your screen. She lives in our village, and she's in charge of surveying these beautiful bright green tansy beetles. They're a very rare species in this country. York is one of the few populations of them. Her job is to go around and survey how they survive each winter and look at how they move from tansy patch to tansy patch. Tansy is a beautiful sort of stinking yellow flower. It got me thinking about AI and asking the right questions and understanding the world around us. All that artificial intelligence does to a mathematician is it fits curves through high-dimensional data sets. And sometimes it interpolates and gets things wrong, and sometimes it extrapolates and gets things wrong. And we can't tell whether it's getting it right or wrong because the space in which it's predicting is so abstract that our brains can't comprehend it. So I think there's worry there. So I apologize to anybody who had to read this very long, worthy abstract. We could say it more simple than that. What I want you to come away from this short webinar with an understanding of is that an idea that's come to me slowly over the years, that telling really simple stories about complex systems can be compelling. People love agreeing with simple stories. The danger is sometimes those simple stories miss the entire point of the way you might want to understand a system, influence a system, or manage a system. And I'm going to give two examples, all based in marine systems, one about fish larvae and one about maximum sustainable yield and management. But getting back to June and her tansy beetles. It's called a tansy beetle. It lives on tansy plant. Tansy is the plant on the left here. It reproduces there, it eats there. If there's no tansy, the beetle dies. And 20 years ago, when I first joined this department in York, we got some tansy beetles. We wanted to model them. We wanted to come up with beautiful models of how these tansy beetles would move from tansy plant to tansy plant and colonize an area to try and build up their population. What we did, you put a tansy beetle in the middle of a tube, you put some tansy at one end, and you put nothing at the other end to get some parameters on how fast my tansy beetle walks towards its tansy plant. What we found was every single time, these things were rubbish. 50% of the time they'd walk towards the tansy plant, 50% of the time they'd walk in the other direction. And yet these things require tansy to survive. We thought we were getting maybe the tube was tilted, maybe the sunlight was direction, but no, everything we tried, we couldn't control for. So we controlled for everything. We still saw this 50-50, go where you should or go where you shouldn't. The reason why is that we were asking completely the wrong question. And it came back to me when I spoke to June yesterday morning when we were out with the dogs, because she pointed out that last year's tansy plants had died and that there were new clumps coming up. And if my beetle only ever went where it had always gone to its local tansy clump, it would never be able to survive these odd, rare, bad springs. Okay, but this is SMMR. We're supposed to be talking about fish. So here's my favorite picture of a fish larva. To a mathematician, all this thing is it's small, it's stupid, and it's dead. Small, meaning it can't really control on a large scale where it can swim to. Stupid in that it's pretty dim. It hasn't got any very complex foraging circuitry built into its head, but it has to eat food. And dead, because a female fish will have several million of these, will lay several million eggs, many of them, each year, most of which will hatch into larvae, and the vast majority of those, like 1 in a million, will survive. So the vast majority of them will die. So what we're seeing there is a rare thing if it's alive. Why do I care about fish larvae? Well, my first postdoc in marine systems was trying to understand the famous stock recruitment relationship, where you have a graph that tries to relate the stock, the amount of biomass in a fish species in a given place, with how many babies that will have successfully in a given year. So we were trying to understand this. The obvious thing to look at is we're asking mathematics somehow to fit the best straight line or curve through these loads of dots of data points. The obvious thing is why? Why would I do that? There's clearly loads and loads of variation happening there. Is there really a stock recruitment relationship in the first place? But we need it. I was going to see later on, we do need to understand this. So we asked ourselves a simple question. If I'm a little, small, stupid fish larva, how fast should I swim to get some food? And you can do the physics of this. It's dead easy. So my fitness, if I choose to swim at a particular speed, well, I'll get a certain amount of food that just drifts past me because of turbulence. So I start with an average benefit, but if I swim faster, the faster I swim, the more food I bang into, the faster I can grow. So that's good. But to swim faster, it turns out, if you look at the physics, it costs me in terms of the square of my speed. So I've got a fitness is A times B times speed minus C times speed squared. That's a quadratic equation that you've all seen at GCSE. You can't pretend that you don't know how to solve these. They're that kind of shape of thing. They've got a top, and that is the optimum speed to go at. You could set that to anybody, and they could find how fast a fish larva should swim. The answer is great. It's about 40 miles an hour. We're clearly getting something wrong. And this is where I'd asked the wrong question, same as we asked the wrong question with my Tansy beetles. And knowing you've asked the wrong question leads you into all kinds of other cool, interesting bits of maths, I think. So what was I getting wrong? Well, we can go straight back to Darwin, who writes beautifully, but in our current age, he would never have survived as a YouTube influencer. He would have needed somebody like Herbert Spencer to come up with beautiful straplines like the survival of the fittest, like he did, because Darwin wrote much more beautifully and carefully and boringly. I'm a mathematician, I love reading Darwin's phrases. Darwin didn't talk about the survival of the fittest. That was far too simple for him. He knew that there were certain ingredients that had to be in his mechanisms for evolution by natural selection. So firstly, there's something about populations tending to grow geometrically. So they might double every year, for example, and that means they become overpopulated. So there's a struggle for life. Secondly, he noticed that if there's a bit of variation between parent and offspring, and if that variation is good, then there's a good chance, but it's a chance, that this will be preserved into the next generation. And his final ingredient was that you tend to look like your parents. With those ingredients, suddenly we can understand that question about how fast a fish should swim in a different light. So the way we approached it was thinking about those ingredients. Darwin said we have to think about the struggle for life, so we have to include populations in here somewhere. So I'm going to ask two questions at the same time using maths. How fast should I swim? But also, how many babies should I have? You can imagine a fish larva starts at a certain size, and it has to grow to be a certain size to be an adult. That seems okay. If I have fewer babies, then I can start them all off a bit bigger, and they've got less growing to do. Whereas if I have millions of babies, they're all going to have to be very small. So that becomes an interesting evolutionary problem. The second ingredient, and again, Darwin talked about this, is if I swim faster, on average, I'll get more food. But I might be unlucky. I might not find anything. I might go in the wrong direction, like the Tansy beetle. So there's a random benefit. On average, it's good, but it's a random process. Whereas the cost is deterministic. It definitely costs me the square of my speed to swim at a given speed. So it's this trade-off between random and deterministic. Oh, sorry, 3 slides which contain maths. I was told not to put any maths in, so don't look at them. Don't look at the equations. I'll tell you about the ingredients that are in here mathematically, but don't switch off yet. So this is going to be a toy model for how fish larvae grow. It's stolen from the maths which people use to cause the stock exchange to crash every now and then, because the models are that stupid. But it's what's called a diffusion process, and we know the maths of it very well. Well, we can put physics in here for our fish to explain the details of that diffusion process. But basically, this has all been done before. It's nothing exciting. But we need to include that extra ingredient that Darwin told us about, which is I've only got a mother fish has only got a certain amount of mass to put into babies, and she's going to divide that into n identical offspring, each one of which has got a size p divided by n. And then we ask, that's going to cause an overpopulation of fish larvae, so we're going to ask who are the fittest fraction 1 over n of those sets of offspring. The math is all obvious when you work it through. It's just back of an envelope, but it is looking technical. So we'll move on to the answer. And we get predictions which are testable. This is lovely in a simple mathematical model because you can challenge yourself with real data sets. What we see is, in this case A, if we've got a very still environment with not much turbulence in the ocean, well, then we can see a fitness maximum that says I should have quite a small number of quite big offspring. And they don't swim very much. They just kind of hang around and they get whatever wafts past them. So a small number, big offspring, that's something like parental care, which we do see in some fish species, rarely, and commonly in places where there's a very still environment, a predictable environment. At the other end, case C, once the turbulence ramps up enough, you get this idea of live fast, die young, exactly what a female cod will do. You have as many babies as you possibly can. They all swim like mad. Almost all of them die, but that still ends up as the evolutionary optimum place to be. That's great. I should go back. I don't know if anybody spotted, but in this picture here, this is a mouth brooding cichlid, I think, from Lake Malawi again, I think. And in her mouth, she's got one of her offspring. If she gets worried, she'll open her mouth. Her children will swim inside and be protected from whatever danger is passing. Okay, brilliant. So I've got predictions, testable. And we got excited, my co-authors and I. We knew FishBase existed. At the time, it was 33,000 species in there. We can surely test our theories across a whole range of species. AI could do this for us. Now you just type it into ChatGPT, it would work. This is what scares me. Because when you filter down those 33,000 into species where we know about the swimming speed of the larvae, there's only 62, and some of those papers aren't very good. So 62 species to test our data set. But then when you filter it down and ask how many of those have also got information about fecundity, we're down to 4 species. So I thought that I was basing my beautiful maths on to produce testable hypotheses. Turns out I can't. When I do test my maths against those 4 points, it fits brilliantly, but there's no way I can publish that with any confidence. So I think this is another hint to why asking the right question matters, but also how massive data sets and massive AI-based interpolation isn't going to get you very far in several of these systems. I put Guy the gorilla in my abstract. Let's not talk about him. I've got a brilliant PhD student working with George Constable, who's in the maths department here. Philip Liu has taken the same ideas and looked at the evolution of gametes and tried to work out why sperm are small and wriggly and move a lot, and why eggs are just big lumps that sit there. One set of equations, different evolutionary outcomes, he can do it all. But taking these ideas and putting them into new applications. Right. So that was a simple story, a simple model to do with a quadratic equation telling us how fast a fish larva might want to swim. And it revealed all kinds of complications and oversimplifications. If you're talking about complications and oversimplifications, I think the world of fisheries management is a fantastic world to live in because it's really complicated and it's important. So let's not think about that for a moment. Two maps here. My daughter's started a geography degree in Durham, and she loves maps. She keeps making me look at them. And I'm learning lots and lots by being forced to do this. So on the left, there's a little section of the border between more or less Belgium at the bottom and Netherlands at the top. But you can see there are bits of Belgium that are in the Netherlands, and there are bits of Netherlands in Belgium, but also there are bits of Belgium which are which are completely contained within the Netherlands, which are themselves completely contained within Belgium, and vice versa. Got this stupid nested arrangement that's really detailed, really complicated, and it looks like a pointless hangover from World War II to me. But when you Google it, that's about as far as my research has gone. This stupid, complex arrangement between two countries has existed for hundreds of years. It's stable. They don't have wars about it. They do have wars, but not about this. This exists, it's stable, and it's deemed useful by both sides. Contrast that really complicated border of borders with the Sahel in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. You can see a lot of the borders here were, frankly, drawn by white men in Paris and London who knew nothing about what was happening. And they just sort of invented some countries with straight line borders between them, nothing like we see in Bala Hertog. And the thing that you might know about the Sahel is it's one of the most troubled and war-torn regions on the planet at the moment. It's the source of most human migrations that are hitting our species at the moment. Sudan is the obvious one at the moment. So what's the difference here? And I'm going to argue that my Bala Hertog example shouldn't work, but it does, because we've got lots of information about this system. There's lots of cultural, geographical, historical information which keeps this thing stable. Whereas in the Sahel, there's a vast cultural heritage. There's amazing history and geography of this Sahel region, and it's based on trade between the forested productive areas to the south and the Sahara Desert to the north. And there's amazing history there, all of which was completely ignored by the colonialists just drawing arbitrary straight lines on maps. And that's what causes the problem. I'm going to argue Bala Hertog is like a stock we understand well. The Sahel is like a data limited stock. Where am I going with this? There's a thing called maximum sustainable yield, which our government has quite innocently signed up to, as along with all the other main seafaring nations. So we are told, we signed up to this in law, that we will only exploit stocks up to a level of maximum sustainable yield and not beyond. So to obey this law that we've set ourselves, we've got to know what maximum sustainable yield is. This is my second equation, but it's the same equation as you saw before for my fish. Trust me. So this is the simple maximum sustainable yield equation. It tells me the number of fish next year is the number of fish I've got this year, plus the number of babies that they have, minus what gets caught. You may or may not like it, but what I want to tell you about this, it looks like a constant plus a constant times b plus a constant times b squared. It's another one of those quadratic equations. It's one of those things that's got a natural hump shape. If you can find the top of that hump, that is your maximum sustainable yield, more or less. I'm cutting some corners there, but that's basically it. My point is that this is easy. You can explain this to a government. You can explain this to lots of governments in lots of different languages, and they'll all agree to it because it's so beautiful and simple and easy. And what I've learned working with the SMMR project and our Pyramids of Life group is that ease in understanding and the ease in agreement actually creates quite a toxic world, because the model is so far from reality that you end up making bad conclusions. So I'm going to scamper through, excuse me, about 4 slides worth of facts about why this equation is bad. It's going to sound like ranting because it is, but bear with me. Fish are really bad parents. Recruitment is unpredictable. You can see knowing my spawning stock biomass doesn't tell me how many recruits I'm going to get next year. It just gives you a vague idea at best. So we can't predict a stock recruitment relationship. Fish move. If I make one place nice for a fish to live and one place horrible, then the fish will go and live where it's nice. We know that. They might do that through behavior or through evolution, but they'll do it. And we can see this. The best examples are in marine protected areas, marine reserves. So yeah, this maximum sustainable yield model ignores all that. Fish evolve. Well, there's none of that in my system. They evolve to reproduce smaller, to reproduce earlier, especially if you're hammering them hard on a fishing regime. They also evolve to be lazy, as Tanya Mita showed during her PhD. And getting back to the pyramids of life story, big fish eat small fish, which eat smaller fish, and so on ad infinitum almost. So this maximum sustainable yield equation here, my quadratic equation, assumes BT is just the mass of fish of that species at that time T. It doesn't care whether that mass is made up of one big creature or lots and lots of tiny creatures. That equation can't tell the difference. But we think, and within the Pyramids of Life project, we think that's a crucial omission from that story. So that was a quick scamper through some literature saying why maximum sustainable yield is bad. It gets countered by people writing a load of big words underneath their maximum sustainable yield equation to try to make people like me shut up. Bayesian approach sounds complicated. Monte Carlo Markov chain, that sounds complicated. Observation process errors. I mean, no, all they're doing is finding better ways to fit the wrong model, in my opinion. But I was lucky enough to be invited to take part in, or to listen in one of the IC's work groups. The first one I've been to was in January of this year, where real practical applied scientists are trying to come up with reliable, defendable catch limits for data limited stocks. They're constrained within this idea of having a maximum sustainable yield concept, which is written into law. But actually, when they come to try to interpret that into something practical, they find themselves having to define many different parameters, different regimes, different subclauses, different sets of rules based on sets of brilliant software, which you have to be a real expert to be able to implement and work on. So it seems like a simple model, but when you try to implement it, pulling with it to make it work, to not drive things to extinction, you've got to add all kinds of caveats. So I'm worried that we might just be using the wrong models entirely. We've signed up to this maximum sustainable yield idea, and it seems to be driving us away from sustainability. So what we're hoping for within our Pyramids of Life project, you can see all these fantastic partners who keep my life stressful. We're trying to work with nature, working with the natural properties of a system, like Darwin, adding my caveats to try to find ways of exploiting fisheries more naturally. Now, many of you might have seen these slides before, but basically, there's what's known as a size spectrum in the ocean. There are lots of small things, a medium number of medium-sized things, and a small number of big things. And the reason that spectrum exists, and it's universal across many ecosystems, is that medium-sized things eat small things to make themselves get a bit bigger, kills the small things, but then the medium-sized things get eaten by the big things. You run that through mathematically, you end up with a size spectrum. It's a stable power law distribution. Within our group, we understand the maths that causes that natural pyramid of numbers, and we know what kind of perturbations to it will cause ecosystem collapse, or which perturbations are actually can be compensated. And what we're working to do is to try to understand how to align the supply and the demand, basically within those ecological pyramids. So can we find ways that to harvest our systems more in balance with nature? I could put it more simply than that. If I catch a fish, at the moment, if I catch a fish, I can see that it's age 3. Fine, that's one piece of information. Things like virtual population analysis use the massive insight that, okay, if it's age 3 now, then it was age 2 last year, and it was age 1 the year before, and they can start to build up a picture of how that fish might have moved. You can see in this picture from the North Sea. I've got different species, but I've also got the same species, but of different sizes. What we're trying to do is get more of an ecosystem picture on this. If I've got a fish here of age 3, then yes, it was a bit smaller and age 2 1 year ago, but in the meantime, it has survived and it's eaten stuff. So that food that it's eaten must have come from somewhere. So actually, I've got information about what that fish was eating simply by the existence of that fish. And if you can pool together all of those little sporadic bits of information, you can actually start to build a full picture of an ecosystem. It's all encapsulated in this software, which Gustav Delius in the maths department at York is heavily involved in writing. MISA, multi-species size spectrum modeling. The beautiful thing here is, what inputs do I need to make these ecosystems? Well, I need to know the names of each species, how big it gets, and more or less how abundant it is. And everything else we can kind of fill in from guesswork, and we can test our models. So we've got machinery here that can do this, and we've even got cheat sheets and methods which lets anybody have access to doing this kind of multi-species modeling. So I said that MSY is bad. How can I take a model like MISA and turn it into something which is useful and useful for giving advice? The answer is, I'm not going to tell you, because there's brilliant people within our group who are going to present all of this at the SMMR conference in Bristol in 2 weeks' time. So yes, we can build models for the North Sea, for the Celtic Sea, and yes, we can say, what if we changed our fishing habits in this way, where we can test what we see, and we can even look at how those changes could be supported or refuted by ecosystem scale indicators. But please don't take my word for it. I'm not going to tread on the toes of the brilliant people who are talking at the conference next week. Right, I think I've wittered on for over 20 minutes. So getting back to where we started with marine management and the Bala-Hertog versus the Sahel, I think for many of our species, we know how they move, we know how many of them there are, we know how we catch them in each different places. That's like a very information-rich data set. That's like Bala-Hertog. We've got lots of information. We can afford to manage those according to maximum sustainable yield because we know enough. Where the data are lacking, and the analogy is with the Sahel and those stupid straight lines, where the data are lacking, we need a framework around which to put those data to understand them. And that's where these size structured models can suddenly tell you an awful lot about what's going on within your ecosystem. I don't just see a fish, I see a fish which must have got there because it has grown and it lives in this ecosystem context. So I think we can do this, which is quite exciting. Take home messages, and thank you for your patience in listening to me. Do talk to mathematicians, because they're great, but also don't necessarily listen to the first thing that they tell you. I spent about 10 years trying to do those stock recruitment relationships and mess around with quadratic equations until it dawned on me that I was asking the wrong question. Quite beautifully, another 10 years after that, I was talking to somebody about the spread of leishmaniasis, which kills an awful lot of people, especially in the Sahel and especially in refugee camps in the Sahel and also in Syria. Turns out the maths of fish foraging is the same as the maths of these sandflies biting people and passing on the disease. So that has been objectively useful. I do think a lot of people working in marine systems get given models by people and they press buttons until they get a nice, colorful, pretty looking output. You'll get something attractive, but whether it's going to be useful or not is not guaranteed. And it takes you as the scientist to step back and ask, what are the inputs and what are the outputs and why is it doing this? Is it actually useful for me? Because of that, my closing positive remark is that I really don't think that we're going to be replaced by ChatGPT yet. And that I've got evidence for that because I've just done a load of marking of undergraduate projects. And yes, you can tell when they've used ChatGPT, and it's usually quite bad. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Perfect. Thanks, Jon.
Sorry, shall I stop? Thanks, Chrissy.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you. That was a great and very insightful presentation. I'm having a look at the chat and the Q&A. So I'll just give people a couple of minutes if they'd like to post some questions. I would like to start with one, if I may, because you were talking about maximum sustainable yield equation. When that law was introduced, or that concept, weren't researchers consulted? I mean, how did that come about?
I'm trying to remember the name of the paper. There's a special issue, and it might be IC's Journal of Marine Science, which goes through the history of this. And it was implemented after World War II at the behest of the American government. And there's some brilliant history in it. It's certainly referred to in the Paulian Froese paper, which I was ranting about previously in my talk. No, I think they knew they had to do something, and there were fisheries scientists involved, but they put something in place rapidly. It was agreed with, and then they stuck with it forever. So there've been. I'm not original. There's been lots of people saying we should try and overturn this sort of thing, but the alternatives are so much more complicated. But they become hard to agree to. So yeah, I think it was led by the Americans, but let's not blame the Americans. And I think it was at the end of World War II. I'm happy to be contradicted. This is a learned audience, I'd like to think.
Yes, please, if somebody knows something, feel free to drop it in the chat.
I can't see the chat, so I'm trusting you, Chrissy.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on it if something pops up. And I'll just go with another question of mine, if that's okay. Regarding the size-structured models and setting a framework, since when is that a practice? That's, yeah.
Since when has it become common to use size-structured models?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I don't think it is yet, and I think it's something which we need to make happen. And there are some brilliant people who are blazing a trail with this, and the obvious person is Julia Blanchard, who's in Tasmania now. She was a PhD student here. In fact, I think her PhD was examined on that table. So yes, there are lots of pushes to do it, but you hit this brick wall of government and regulators knowing that they've signed up legally to an idea of maximum sustainable yield, which ignores size structure. It just says, what is people talk of a stock of 100,000 tons of a particular species in a given place, regardless of the fact that that could be made up of lots of small things or a small number of big things, and the fact that they're going to move. So yeah, we're trapped in this regulatory environment, and I'm trying to find ways. I'm not trying to overturn things completely. I'm sure we can find ways to use that size-based information in ways which align with what the fishermen can catch and with what we can legally do in terms of maximum sustainable yield to get better exploitation. And sorry, I'll stop ranting. We might go on to other things later.
Yeah, that's fine, please.
Well, I was just going to. I'm just going to say that many people who've tried to impose this idea of size-based harvest have used a concept called balanced harvest, which is a big sort of a turn-off for an awful lot of fisheries managers, as far as I understand. It's become kind of an evangelical cause. We must use balanced harvest. The idea of balance makes sense. We all want to be balanced. That sounds fine. But how you actually describe what that balance is matters crucially to how you implement it in terms of fishing. And it's not easy. You need to be harvesting according to the rate of carbon flow through a particular size and a particular species at a given time. That's quite hard to do practically, and it's quite hard to sell to people because people want to eat the big stuff. And it also brings some dangers, like you end up killing too many of the fish before they get large enough to reproduce. So because of that, this kind of evangelism for balanced harvest can easily be misplaced, but I think there's scope for doing it properly, which we're seeing through our project, I hope.